section, as I said, we're going to be taking a look at Sunday, and as before, we look at this topic from a few different perspectives. We're going to be taking a look at its history, its theology, and pedagogy. And again, just to reiterate, I suppose, we're really only skimming the top of the water, if you like, because we're not going into huge depth in terms of any of these. This is a certificate course, so you're just getting some introductory information in relation to these. So here's the intended learning outcomes of this particular section, and I would hope that by the end of this section that you'll be able to provide some overview of the history of Sunday, explain 10 descriptive titles for Christian Sunday, and name some ways in which to develop a sense of Sunday for children. So you can see that's coming from our historical perspective, theological perspective, and the pedagogical one. So Sunday is not just a day, not even a day apart. It's like a symbol or a sacrament of Christians' lives with God in Christ. And like the other sacraments, Sunday offers insight into the life lived together in the unity of the Spirit, and itself draws Christians into that mystery and that life. So I just want to mention that term, the mystery of Sunday. Mystery means a symbol or sacrament, mysterion. And not a mystery in the sense of something that we can't understand, so much as something that we can only understand by living with it and can never explain exhaustively. It's that nature of mystery that's encompassed here. So we're starting with Sunday because it is the kernel of the whole liturgical year. And when we were looking at Eucharist, you might remember me saying that every Sunday is a little Easter and every Easter is a great Sunday. So Sunday is, if you like, the foundational day. Okay, so let's begin then with history. And what we're going to take a look at first of all is Scripture. So we're looking at the Bible and we're seeing how did Sunday emerge in the Bible. So let's just remember that up until Jesus' death and resurrection, the time when Jesus' friends would have gathered together with Jesus would have been on the Sabbath. But after Jesus' death and resurrection, we hear many stories which happened on the first day of the week. And the first day of the week for Jewish people was Sunday. The Sabbath was the Saturday, and then the first day of the week, as I explained before, which would have been a working day, was Sunday. So in these chapters of the Gospels, we hear stories which occurred on the first day of the week. So the Gospels contain 15 resurrection stories. There are 11 appearances, and then 4 of those inputs or stories occur around the tomb on the day of the resurrection. We hear things like on the first day, on that same day, 8 days later. So we'll just very briefly look through some of those. So this is what happens on the first day of the week. These are some of the things that the risen Jesus did. So in Matthew's Gospel, we hear 3 stories. The story of the angels and women at the tomb, Jesus meeting the women and they didn't recognize him, and Jesus and the 11 at the Sea of Galilee. Again, in Mark's Gospel, then we have the story of 3 women, that's at the tomb again, and Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the women, Jesus and the 2, that's the road to Emmaus, and then Jesus and the 11. Luke, we hear the story of the 2 men, the women, and the apostles, and Peter, that's the resurrection story. The Emmaus too, and that's the road to Emmaus where Jesus appeared to his disciples. Jesus and the apostles, that's in the upper room, and Jesus by the Sea of Tiberias. So again, moving into John's Gospel, we see in John's Gospel that on the first day of the week, the disciples assembled, and Jesus was present. And their faith was sought and expressed. And we remember the story of doubting Thomas. And then again in the Acts of the Apostles, you see some more examples there of what happened on the first day of the week. that the early Christians, the early Christian community gathered, assembled together, where there was preaching and it was broken. Again, St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the first day of the week, collection for the needy. So again, social justice side of things really starting to emerge. And in the book of Revelations, again, we see it was the Lord's Day. So from all of these slides, we can see that by the end of the New Testament, the pattern was established. And that pattern was that Sunday was a day set aside for Christians. It was something that distinguished them from the Sabbath of the Jews. So let's move on now beyond scriptures and take a look at other documentary evidence of what early Sunday was like in the early church. So the next 10 or so slides will look at evidence such as that. And we're going to begin with the Didache. Now the Didache was written around the middle of the 1st century, during the time of the apostles themselves, possibly AD 50 or could have been later than that, contemporaneous with the writings of Paul. So the Didache deals with matters that would have been arising for the early Christians, such as how to detect apostles who were genuine and not genuine, and same with prophets, how to celebrate the sacraments, guidelines around Christian morality. There was even reference to abortion. So again, in the Didache, we see this uttered, that on the Lord's own day assemble in common to break bread and to offer thanks. This was a teaching that was being espoused. Again, Ignatius of Antioch, in the early 2nd century, spoke about how converts ordered their lives according to the Lord's Day. There's another name now coming in for on the first day. We now have the Lord's Day. Again, I spoke to you about this before. Pliny, in a letter to the Emperor Trajan, so the Emperor Trajan sent Pliny the Younger to Bithynia around the year 111 to settle a troubled situation, and they corresponded regularly during Pliny's mission. So here's one of his descriptions of what he saw. He said, Christians gather before dawn on a fixed day, sing a hymn to Christ, and later assemble to take food together. So they met in the morning, remember it was a working day, they met before work, and then they gathered later on to celebrate the Eucharist. One of the early church fathers, Justin Martyr, in the 2nd century again, talked about the structure emerging. The structure of the Mass was beginning to emerge. And the word, so the liturgy of the word, liturgy of the Eucharist. And Justin Martyr speaks of the word Sunday. Again, this is something that was taken from pagan culture, I suppose, where the sun was adored, and this was then taken over as something very Christian. There's another document. So this is the title of a Christian document, which presents itself as having been written by the apostles in the early church. But again, it's disputed as to its exact timing. Some would say that it was composed in the 3rd century. But again, it doesn't matter exactly the date of it. It just illustrates to us how important this assembly of Christians, the early church community, was. So they were saying not to assemble diminishes the church and causes the body of Christ to be short of a member. Here's another example of how important Sunday came to be for the early church community. So the martyrs of Abatina were a group of 49 Christians who in the year 304, were found guilty of having illegally celebrated Sunday worship at Abatina. Now don't forget that Sunday worship was forbidden. So this was in a Roman town in the province of Africa. And some of the martyrs gave testimony at the time. So their priest said, we must celebrate the Lord's Day. It is a law for us. The lector said, yes, it was in my house that we celebrated the Lord's Day. We cannot live without celebrating the Lord's Day. And again, another woman who was there on that day said, I attended the meeting because I am a Christian. So Christians gathered together in secret because, again, it was outlawed for them to gather together and celebrate. That is until the year 3-1. So Constantine and the year 313, I just want to expand on that for a minute and just to explain. I think I did mention this in Eucharist, when we were talking about the Eucharist as well, but in 303, the year 313, the Edict of Milan emerged. This was a proclamation that permanently established religious toleration for Christianity within the Roman Empire. And it was an outcome of a political agreement between this guy here, Constantine, and another Roman emperor. So Constantine declared Sunday to be a day of rest. You can see another characteristic developing around Sunday. It should be a day of laxity and absenteeism, so no work, and then exhortations to attend. So some kind of a movement towards pushing people to attend. And then we have in Alvera, in Spain, in the year 321, where an actual ruling was suggested, and that would be that if you missed 3 consecutive Sundays of these gatherings of the early church, that you were excluded from communion. So that was a serious consequence. That was the church council in Algeria. So having looked at the early centuries of the church, we're now going to fast forward to the Middle Ages. And here we see that lay participation was minimised and the focus was on the clerical. So again, I'm hoping that some of this is familiar to you from the time when we talked about Eucharist and how the many altars which were characterised the early Christian communities when they gathered were reduced to one altar, and then that one altar then became the place where the priest and the community didn't gather around it as they did in their early gatherings. So the Middle Ages saw more of a focus on the clerical. There's some more characteristics of the period. You can see spectacular liturgies of the soulless, and the emergence of the church as an institution rather than the body of Christ. Emphasis on the suffering and passion of Christ, so that's the Mass was more focused on that. Again, Latin being the language of the Mass. You have the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation, which was the Council of Trent, seeking to address some charges of the Reformation. I just want to explain there 17th century Jansenism. This was a heresy, I suppose, but originated as a Catholic theological movement, primarily in France, which emphasised original sin and human depravity and the necessity of divine grace. And so it was a heresy because it was an over-exaggeration of and an over-emphasis on the evil nature of man. And it originated from the work of Cornelius Jansen, who died in 1638. It did have an impact on Catholicism and Irish Catholicism, because a lot of the Irish monks travelled to France to be formed and be trained. And those Irish monks brought back this heresy with them, or this slant towards this heresy. And then in turn they travelled to the US, and I mean, many people would attribute that notion of Catholic guilt to this form of Jansenism. And another thing that emerged at that time too was the cults of saints and relics. So they were an important part of religion during this time as well. So for example, the remains of the Holy Dead were thought to have miraculous powers that could convert pagans and cure the sick. So still to this day, the cult of the saints is there as well. So it wasn't until the 20th century that we have a full rediscovery of what Sunday really means. So I explained to you before how the Second Vatican Council was an attempt to go back to the origins, and that was a big part of what happened. But obviously the Second Vatican Council, which occurred in the 60s, didn't occur in a vacuum. It had been building up. So a liturgical movement had emerged in the early 20th century. I spoke to you before about Pope Pius X as well, who was concerned at the non-participation of people and non-celebration of people in communion. So he lowered the age at which people could celebrate their first communion. Pope Pius XII, later on in the 50s then, developed the work of Pius X. So he also continued some liturgical reforms as well, and some of the things that he did, for example, was to bring in evening masses, introduce evening masses. He also reduced the severity of fasting, whereas before people had to fast from midnight the night before until Mass the following morning. He relaxed that, and fasting was reduced to 2 hours for solid food and 1 hour for liquid. So these were things that were paving the way for the Second Vatican Council, which was instituted by John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd. So it's in the Second Vatican Council document and the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy that we actually see the fruits of this work. And then you'll see there GNLYC, that stands for the General Norms for Liturgical Year and Calendar, which outline Sunday as the basis for the liturgical year, and then the rest of it. So Sunday was restored, or that was the aspiration anyway. So as I said, that's a brief overview of the history of Sunday, how in the early church it had been a community of people gathering together to celebrate, and then as we moved through the years, how that became routinized and different emphasis were placed on different aspects. So we're going to take a look at the theology of Sunday as well. And we're going to do that by taking a look at 10 different titles which can be attributed to Sunday. So when liturgical scholars proclaim that Sunday is everything and that it may be viewed as the sacrament of Christian life, what they're indicating is that this institution, which we term Sunday, is so rich in meaning that it contains within itself much of what Christianity is all about. So by peeling back the layers of meaning of this special day, we can see what these writers are talking about. And this can be accomplished by going through 10 descriptive headings for Sunday, which are used by many writers, including Pope John Paul himself, his apostolic letter, which I'll speak to you about in a few minutes. So here are the 10 titles for Sunday. I just want to give a brief explanation of each of those. So first of all, we have the Day of Resurrection. So the Second Vatican Council were very strong on this one. They called Sunday the original feast day and see it as taking its origins from the very day of Christ's resurrection. So if anyone really wants to know what Sunday means, they must go back to that resurrection day at its first commemoration, 1 week later, when the risen Lord again appeared among his disciples. An exploration of the resurrection stories in the Gospels indicates such a phenomenal amount of activity on the part of the risen Lord on these first 2 Sundays of Christianity, so the day of his resurrection and then 1 week later, that by the end of the New Testament, Sunday is no longer referred to as the first day of the week, but as the Lord's Day. And we spoke about that a little bit earlier as we were going through some of those historical overviews. So Day of Resurrection. Now, there's a writer, which I've uploaded his writings for you, who was critical of this overemphasis on the term of the day of the resurrection, because he thinks there's a danger in overemphasizing this, because Jesus didn't exhort people to remember him for his resurrection, and this writer just speaks about that and sees a danger in that. Okay, the next title then, Day of Revelation. So the resurrection on Easter Sunday is linked to the death of Jesus on Good Friday. We've spoken about that before, the Paschal mystery, the life, death and resurrection. These 2 events are intertwined. Jesus surrendered before God, and God his Father responded by raising him from the dead. So this dialogue or interaction between the death and resurrection could have taken place unknown to anyone else, but God chose to reveal it so that all people would know the way to God, which Jesus was here portraying. Others in time might then live in surrender and obedience to God. So kenosis is the term emptying of oneself, and that's what Jesus did. He died to God. And so Sunday is a day of revelation when the nature of true relationship with God is revealed. Another title for Sunday is Day of Encounter. Initially, the fact of the resurrection was announced by heavenly creatures or angels near the tomb. However, the definitive revealing occurred with the appearances of Jesus himself to his disciples on the evening of the resurrection day, and also 1 week later on the same first day of the week. And these appearances of the risen Lord on the first 2 Sundays of the Christian era led subsequent generations of believers to look upon Sunday as a day when the Lord could be encountered in faith in a special and real way. And the early Christians held on to the belief that the second coming of the Lord would appear on Sunday. Sunday can be viewed as a day of assembly. So while the risen Lord did encounter Mary Magdalene while she was on her own, the pattern which does emerge from the Gospel accounts is that Jesus was more likely to appear to his followers when they were together. And so from the very beginning, the idea of assembling ecclesia, church, on this day became a defining characteristic of Christians' life. And I read to you a few moments ago as well. It marked out the Christians, marked them apart from their Jewish counterparts who were meeting on the Sabbath. So this meeting on Sunday marked them as Christians. Sunday is a day of worship, or a day of Eucharist. When the early followers of Jesus did gather on the Lord's Day, they soon linked it to the celebration of the Lord's Supper. Indeed, on the very day of the resurrection itself, Jesus broke bread with the 2 disciples and they reached Emmaus. An ancient Christian saying goes as follows: no Sunday without an assembly, no assembly without the Eucharist. And later on, the day would take on other prayer elements, making it a whole or full day of worship. Sunday must be a great doorway, letting the life of heaven into everyday life and giving strength for the work of the rest of the whole week. Sunday is a day of rest. It was only in the 4th century that Sunday became a day of rest. I mentioned that before with Constantine. The idea of ritually and religiously resting from work is a precious part of the Jewish and Christian traditions. And Jewish people to this day would honour the Sabbath. Devout Jewish people would honour the Sabbath in a very real way. And some Orthodox Jews would not even drive a car or engage in any kind of work that could be classed as work. It means that there is one day of the week when humans depend on the providence of God instead of being feverishly engaged in increasing productivity. Such resting is a religious and a faith stance and runs contrary to the culture of competition and consumerism. And someone said, to keep the Sabbath is not so much a matter of activity or inactivity, but rather it's a question of the purpose of one's activity and indeed of one's life. So if somebody was repairing a home for somebody who's in difficult situations, that would be fine. Although it's meant to be a day of rest, this activity is an activity that would please God. Sunday as a day of contemplation. So as we know, modern culture abhors a vacuum, and it's very easy when a space is created for it to become cluttered with all sorts of time fillers and frivolous pastimes. The true purpose of the religious rest is for the sake of lifting one's eyes from earth to heaven. For contemplation, prayer, religious reading and reflection are practices viewed traditionally as being very appropriate on this day. I love this phrase of Edith Stein's. She said, one arrives at silence through emptiness, and at emptiness through silence. I think you could equally substitute God for the word emptiness. One arrives at silence through God, and at God through silence. Okay, day of joy. So the fruit of contemplation is joy. When we contemplate, we feel joy. Joy is an emotion or quality which emerges from engagement with truth and goodness and beauty. And because Sunday is concerned with the reality of human divine relationships as revealed in the Paschal mystery of Jesus, it can engender joy in the believer. So Justin Martyr, who we spoke about earlier in the 2nd century, called Sunday Day of Delight. And the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, coined it Day of Joy. And with the passing of time, ideals can become clouded, and it's no surprise to learn that numbers of believers at varying times in history lost fervour in the observance of the Lord's Day. And this gave rise to a certain legalism, which spoke of Sunday as a day of obligation. Obligations can be filled out of fear, out of duty, or out of love. Fulfilling the Sunday obligation out of love for God is the ideal to be sought. So I always, when I'm thinking of this day of obligation, I always think of my sister when we were younger. She was 15, 16, and she had gone camping for the weekend down the country, and when she came back on the train, she arrived back on a Sunday, and my dad picked her up. It was probably about 8 o'clock by the time she got in, and one of the first things he asked her, having greeted her, was, well, did you get Mass? And she thought she was safe enough saying no. Well, she said no, but she thought that was it. But nothing would do but to bring her to Mass on the Quay. I think it was a late Mass in City Quay or something, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock Mass. So that was the strength of the feeling around it being a day of obligation. And again, she murdered me for saying this, but even, in her early years of being married, she wouldn't answer the phone on a Sunday morning in case it was somebody from the family ringing her and she wasn't going to Mass. So that's taken it to the extremes, I suppose. And finally then, day of eternity. So Sunday is a day of rest, and heaven is a place of rest with no work to be done, only people to be with. Hence Sunday is seen by Christians as a foretaste of what is to come. Keeping Sunday is seen as a weekly rehearsal for the eternal Sunday. In the book of Revelations we hear it referred to as the day without evening. It's a day of personal decision for each one as regards how to keep it. Okay, so there are 10 titles, and I suppose in a way those titles are all searchers of meaning for Sunday. Not that there isn't meaning inherent, that there isn't enough there, but people were putting their own slant on it. Now, I've spoken to you earlier about how Samuel Bacciocchi, said totally wrong, that I was reluctant to say his name, but anyway, he's an Italian, and he critiqued one or two of those titles for Sunday. I suppose it's like anything, if we should have balance between how we view Sunday, that it shouldn't all be one or the other. And we can see in a history how the faith of believers works within the limitations of their time, or what was going on in their time as well. But I think these 10 titles are helpful in terms of helping Catholics to be faithful to the tradition they received, and that there is something to be learned from each of the approaches or titles. For Christians struggle to find ways in which to live the mystery of Sunday, they can be sure that they are one with those who did so before as well. So just for a moment, I just ask you to just look at those 10 titles and just for yourself, just think which of those seems to make more sense for you. Whether or not you are a Christian, Catholic Christian, practicing, non-practicing, but just in terms of your understanding of Sunday, which of those make most sense to you. Okay, so I just want to return for a minute now to history before we move on to look further at celebrating Sunday. And I just want to read a little piece from a German theologian who moved to the US and spent most of her life in the US. But she's describing a time when, for Catholics, Sunday was a day when people went to Mass. And I'll just read you this for a moment. Older Catholics can still remember an indefinable aura of Sunday. It was special in a preconceptual, unreflected way that was pure gift to us as we were growing up. It had to do with being dressed up in Sunday best, a certain sense of quiet and expectation, the family gathering for the trip to church, the concern not to eat or drink because of the communion fast. It also had to do with Saturday night confession and getting everything ready beforehand. The atmosphere of the church also contributed to the feeling. The dim light and solemn silence in which one greeted one's friends with a silent nod or smile, if at all, while aware of the solidarity of the worshipping community in which most of us knew one another well. After church, we enjoyed the delayed and festive family breakfast and perhaps a family outing while we were still in special Sunday clothes. The day might end with a return to church for benediction. A sense of leisure pervaded the day because shops and places of business were closed and public transportation was on a reduced schedule. It was a good day for visiting friends because we did no housework, gardening or personal chores. We enjoyed the leisure and could assume that others did too. Sunday in those days was not just in church. It was in the air and food and clothes and all over the house and the street. For old-fashioned observant Catholics, the culture and customs of their society carried the sense of Sunday naturally, spontaneously, without special planning or reflection. The liturgy might be poorly celebrated, the church building and its appurtenances aesthetically appalling, the congregation silent and passive, the preaching unrelated to the scripture readings, and the language unintelligible to most. But the Mass was simply the Mass, the centre of everything, and Sunday was graciously, pervasively, and unapologetically Sunday. So what Monica Helvig is describing there is a time when for Catholics it was just a given that Catholics went to Mass on Sunday. And I can relate very much to what she's saying there, although I would come from a couple of decades after her. But in my childhood, Sunday was a day when we went to Mass and our neighbours went to Mass. And it was just what you did. And you dressed up. There was no Sunday trading, and it was a day of rest, and it was a special day, and there was special food. But I think we've become quite secularised in terms of our culture. And I'm not sure, even leaving religion outside of it, I'm not sure that's a great thing. Because we're so caught up in hectic lives that we lead, that to have one day set aside is important. And it's hard to do that in secular culture. I know from sporting occasions and sports games, even on a Sunday morning, they take place on Sunday morning. So there's a clash between Sunday worship and sporting fixtures. So it's difficult to choose to celebrate Mass on a Sunday. It's not an easy option. But then, as we've said from the very outset, Christianity is a radical choice, and conversion is at the heart of it. But for Catholics, the wonder is, has Sunday become so secular now that its religious nature, are retrieving it? Is it possible to retrieve it as a day for God? Let's look beyond that. But there is a crisis of Sunday. And it's not something new, it's something that's been happening a long time. And there's a sadness around that for Catholics. I'm speaking personally now as well for myself. When you go to Mass and there are so few families celebrating Mass, there's a sadness around that. And it's a sadness for families who are missing out, and also a sadness for the community who is missing, and obviously is not a life-giving place for these families. So what's gone wrong? Certainly the Eucharist of itself is life-giving, and I've spoken to you again about the life-giving, what Catholics believe about life-giving, how life-giving the Eucharist is. But what is it about how we celebrate the Mass, or how we include people in our Mass, that is not attracting people? So these are challenges for a Catholic Church. and challenges that are not unique to Ireland, obviously, because we're living in a post-Christian era in Europe. But on the contrary, in sub-Saharan countries, Catholicism is on the increase. So let's go back, or not go back, but let's take a look at some suggestions, and I'm taking these from my former boss, the first person who would have been relational. Spend time with family and friends and God. So that's something that could be important to do. And that's something that a lot of families do. In my own family, we have certain rituals. We have breakfast on a Sunday morning, and we have dinner on a Sunday evening, in terms of both sides of the family, in-laws and blood relations. That's something that we do, and it does mark Sunday out as being a special time. And if we didn't have that ritual, I'm not sure that we'd get to see our families as frequently as that. And contemplation. So Ray Topley would encourage us to make time to reflect and make time for ourselves. Experience Christ through silence, meditation and reflection, and see Sunday as an opportunity to get to know God and allocate time on a Sunday to do this. So there are just some of the things that could encourage a Catholic in terms of their celebration of Sunday as their Lord's Day, or a special day of God. I put up on Luke for you as well. It's Dies Domini, and it was written by John Paul II in 1998. It's an apostolic letter in which he addresses exclusively the Lord's Holy Day, addresses Sunday, and you'll see in it how John Paul addresses each of the 10 titles we've been talking about, and espouses different ways of honouring Sunday. So that might be something we could take a look at. So in virtue of its significance as the day of the risen Lord, celebrating God's work of creation and new creation, Sunday is a day of joy in a very special way, indeed the most suitable for learning how to rejoice and discover the true nature and deep roots of joy. And that's a quote from John Paul's apostolic letter. Here's another one. Through Sunday rest, daily concerns and tasks can find their proper perspective. The material things give way to spiritual values. Sunday should also give the faithful an opportunity to devote themselves to works of mercy, charity, and apostolate. So again, people can be very critical of church and critical of all that goes on in church. But from my own perspective, I truly value it, and I value a church that encourages rest and contemplation and a relationship with God, with others, and with myself. And Sunday is a day to embrace all of these. Okay, so teaching on Sunday. Let's take a look at the curriculum and see what the curriculum teaches about Sunday. And as you're doing this, I'd ask you just in your own mind, see what's missing from this. Or is there anything missing? So in the preschool level, the children are taught that Sunday is a special day when Catholics gather together to celebrate the Mass. And again, that might seem facile, but for many, many, many children who wouldn't, that would be new knowledge to them, even though they may be baptised Catholics. Level 1, junior and senior infants, the children learn that Sunday is a day of rest for the church family. And that on Sunday, Catholics gather together to celebrate the Mass. Again, it reiterates that. Level 2, the day of resurrection. Sunday is the Lord's Day because Jesus rose from the dead, so day of resurrection. One of the commandments, the third commandment, asks that we keep holy the Lord's Day, the Sabbath. So an element of obligation there. That's first and second class. Third and fourth class then look at the Lord's Day, the day of resurrection, and that on that day we should rest from work and gather to celebrate the Eucharist. And again, the obligation around Mass on Sundays. And in level 4 then, precepts of the Church, which again talks about obligation. So if you're just thinking back to the 10 titles that we had, is there anything there that could have been emphasised that may not be emphasised, that you would like to see more of a slant on? The day of resurrection, is there enough there on day of joy? Perhaps you might like to include some more on that yourself. I'm going back now to Ray Topley again. He was a great teacher, and I draw a lot from his work. He was very generous in his work as well. So here are some of the things he says that are important in terms of developing a Christian sense of Sunday in children. So he talks about, in teaching, he says, prepare some well thought out lessons on Sunday, and make children familiar with the rituals of Sunday. He says, engage the children in discussion and get them to discuss what Sunday means to them and their families. Get them talking about my special Sunday. So inculcating a sense of Sunday as a day apart. There's an 11th title we could add, Sunday Day Apart. Mass related. Get the children involved in an organised Sunday, Children's Sunday Mass. Again, Ray would have been writing in a different time. This may not be something that I would suggest that you might do. Teach them the prayers said at Mass. Now, this is something that is in the curriculum and in the new programme as well. And show them how to participate in Mass and respect their day of rest. So just to go back, in case I caused any confusion there, the one where Ray was saying, get children involved in an organised Children's Sunday Mass. I think we really have to learn to separate out parish and school. And the thrust is moving more towards that. So that the place of the school is around religious education or catechesis on Sunday, so teaching about Sunday, rather than the work of the parish, which is really to engage children in liturgies. So it's trying to encourage the complementary roles. Remember we said the homeschool and parishes roles are different but complementary. The school has, I think, taken on more than it should have, has had to take on more because the other two partners weren't as active. The school took on an awful lot. So again, just to reiterate, perhaps those teachers who enjoy that type of work of preparing children for Sunday liturgy, that might offer their services in the parish. The readings for Mass, and this is something that can be done during your religious education lesson. During the week, prepare the children as to what readings will come up on the following Sunday. And on Fridays, read and explain the upcoming Gospel for children. And I'll speak to you about this in the later section when we talk about preparing Masses, and that there are some lovely resources available to help you in doing that. And perhaps, again, this is written in a different time, on Mondays reflect on the readings of Sunday and their meaning. Again, this will be something I would be reluctant to do because there's an assumption there that everybody's at Mass on Sunday. But certainly on the Fridays you could read and explain the upcoming Gospel to children. Practice. Don't give homework for the weekend, and emphasise that you're doing this because Sunday is a day of rest. Get the children to make a list of things done on Sundays which make it different to other days, and keep adding to that list to make it even more special. So encouraging the children to recover the sense of Sunday that may not be there for them. Ask the children on Fridays one thing that they can do on a Sunday, and maybe a church visit. They can see the church. Praying, and there's a nice suggestion on Ray's part. He says, make up a prayer for Sunday or about Sunday. For example, dear God, we thank you for the gift of Sunday. So there are just some simple things that you can choose to do with your class. Okay. Okay, so that brings us to an end of this PowerPoint. So at the start I said that the intended learning outcomes were that you would be able to provide an overview of the history of Sunday, hopefully you'll be able to do that. List and briefly explain 10 descriptive titles for the Christian Sunday. Name some ways in which to develop a sense of Sunday for children.